creepy modern mysteries that are still unsolved. Most people don't realize how common mysteries are. Honestly, if you pay attention, you'll find mysteries all around us. Just the other day, I was sitting at a cafe when I lost one of my most prized possessions. I left my hat on my seat as I went to the bathroom for maybe 2 minutes. But when I got back, my hat was gone. But the weirdest part was that the cafe was full of people and not a single person saw who took my hat. Luckily, I have a lot of hats, and in the grand scheme of things, that wasn't really a hard mystery to figure out. But not all mysteries are as easy to crack. In fact, today I've compiled a list of mysterious crimes, events, entities, and other unsolved mysteries so perplexing that to this day they remain unsolved. And as always, this list gets scarier as it goes on. Number 1, the missing wrecking ball. In 1974, workers for the Dowling Construction Company in Indianapolis left their crane to go home, just like any other day. As usual, the 5-ton steel wrecking ball remained hanging from this crane about 200 feet in the air. The next morning, the entire wrecking ball was flat out gone. And no, it hadn't fallen to the ground, it was gone from the entire site. The whole town, along with police, were baffled by this bizarre theft and that the wrecking ball was never found. Apparently, some people criticized them for leaving the wrecking ball like that, but I mean, what else are you supposed to do? Detach the wrecking ball and roll it into a giant adamantium safe for good keeping? Also, what's the motive for stealing a 5-ton wrecking ball? According to my research, 5 tons of steel is only worth about $800. Imagine going through all of the effort of stealing a 5-ton wrecking ball and still not having enough money to afford 9 grams of gold. Part of me wonders if the reason this case went cold is because nobody really cared. I mean, if I had to spend more time tracking down a defective wrecking ball on the loose than completing the construction project with my crew, I'd probably just forget it too. I'd like to think that everyone just assumed that somehow the cable cut itself loose and the ball comically rolled 2 miles down the road at night off a cliff into the ocean. The worst part about this case is the more I researched it, the more mysterious it became. If you look up this company, you'll find that they're pretty much only known for losing this wrecking ball. And in one newspaper from the same time period, I was able to find a story with an interview from the owner of the company who lost the ball. The funniest part about the story is that Lauren Dowling, the owner of the Dowling Construction Company, said, and I quote, "I can't figure out what someone would want to do with a 5-ton metal ball." Then another newspaper I found provided a couple more details in the story. In this paper, an interviewer named Beck Walter asked someone who knew about the story personally, "Is this story true? If so, when and where did it happen? Was the ball ever found?" Then, Sincero, the man she was interviewing, said, "It's true, according to Lauren Dowling, owner of the firm. His workers were tearing down and erecting a boys' club on the Indianapolis South Side during the summer of 1974. Just like your book says, the huge ball was hanging about 200 feet in the air from a crane at the end of the workday and was gone 8 hours later when the workers returned. The crane didn't appear to be tampered with," said Dowling, "but the ball was never recovered." What's also strange about this case is that no leads for any potential suspects were ever found, which is confusing considering you would probably need to run some seriously loud equipment in order to manage carrying a steel ball the weight of multiple cars away in the middle of the night. On top of this, the thieves left no tire tracks. Also, it didn't look like the thieves had tampered with the crane, and the wrecking ball didn't seem to have fallen because there was no crater on the ground where it would have landed. If you're open to some pretty crazy conclusions, I found some people on a mystery forum theorizing that some type of interdimensional time traveler from the future somehow teleported the wrecking ball into a different universe to save someone from a Final Fantasy style incident that was destined to kill them. So, yeah. All in all, no matter how you choose to interpret the story, although this is a tame example, the story is still rather strange. Number 2, kidnapped by Sasquatch. Nowadays, when we hear about Bigfoot, we typically laugh, but that's only because we were born in the modern day. Today, Bigfoot has become a meme, but this is only because most people in the modern era live in a town, city, or some sort of civilization that is not so rural. But for those in the past or even today who still live deep in the woods, woodland creatures are nothing to laugh at. It's easy to laugh at a mysterious creature when you're deep in the city, surrounded by humans living in a concrete building, but it's not so easy to laugh at a creature of the woods when you live in a wooden house in the middle of nowhere and you realize the creature you fear so deeply could tear the roof off of your house. These stories are stories of people alone, surrounded by woods, with truly no idea what lies beyond their small house's boundaries. When you're deep in the woods, you truly have no idea what's out there. Technology won't be there to save you. And in the times that these historic accounts took place, there was no GPS, no walkie-talkie, and no phone. The only satellites flying around Earth at this point were lonely, barren asteroids. And if you got lost in the woods, the question wasn't what your odds of dying were, it was what your odds of living were. In this time, a man had to come face to face with his own natural habitat and anything that dwells within it. When I tell you of these accounts, you have to keep in mind that these aren't just urban folklore. They are actual published accounts that resulted from real-life adventures before the internet and before safety. Also, there weren't cities and towns populating almost every area of the Earth like there are today. So if you were alone in the wilderness, at times the empty asteroid orbiting you in space was closer to you than the nearest human. What most modern day people forget is that the concept of Bigfoot or Sasquatch came from multiple real-life accounts from real people who often came across Bigfoot face to face. Before I begin this story, I want to preface it with an interesting fact. According to historical accounts, Albert Ostman, the man who had this strange encounter, refused to tell anyone his story for many years because, in his words, he didn't think that anybody would believe him. To be honest, if I had something as crazy as the story I'm about to tell you happen to me, I wouldn't think anyone would believe me either. Nevertheless, many of the details in his description ended up being consistent with other similar accounts of creatures in the same area that came out later. Keep in mind that this was long before the internet, and it's pretty unlikely that Albert was able to communicate with the others who came out with similar descriptions later on. In 1924, Albert Ostman, who was a logger and construction worker, had a vacation. When people in our era, the modern day, think of going on vacation, we imagine going on a cruise, or maybe going to the beach, or maybe even staying at a nice lake house. But Albert was an absolute mad lad, and his idea of a vacation was searching for a lost gold mine, rumored to be at the head of the Toba Inlet in British Columbia. In all honesty, I wish I was this cool. Sasquatch or not, deciding that for your vacation, you're gonna trek through the wilderness alone, looking for a lost gold mine like you're Indiana Jones, has to be one of the more badass things I've heard in a long time. Also, sometimes I forget before video games, people just used to do badass things because they just felt like it. There was no social media, no online approval for doing something cool, nothing. People like this guy just did real life side quests because they felt like it. Anyways, apparently when he was on his way to the supposed area, an old Indian boatman warned him about, quote, huge, hairy, big people living in the mountains near the abandoned mine he was looking for. But he just shrugged it off, saying that he, quote, refused to believe old Indian fables about mountain giants. Once he finally got to the inlet where the gold mine was supposedly close to, he left the Indian boatman and started hiking. According to his account, all he brought with him was his rifle, pack sack of food, cooking utensils, sleeping bag, and a ground sheet. After hiking for about a week, he settled down at a camping spot between two big trees that happened to be next to a freshwater spring. For Albert, this campsite was perfect, except for the fact that every morning it appeared that someone or something had rummaged through his supplies and taken all of his food. Albert, being the mad lad we knew he was, instead of being scared and going home or just being plain upset, he made a plan. He climbed into his sleeping bag fully clothed with his rifle right next to him so he could attack whoever or whatever was stealing his food. Like many of us at the sleepover, Albert was the first to fall asleep, and what he woke up to was insane. I was awakened, he wrote, by something picking me up. I was half asleep, and at first I did not remember where I was. As I began to get my wits together, I remembered that I was on a prospecting trip and in my sleeping bag. My first thought was it must be a snowslide, but there was no snow around my camp. Then it felt like I was tossed on horseback, but I could feel whatever it was walking. According to Albert, the creature was carrying him in his sleeping bag, kind of like a DoorDash delivery guy, but not just for a few minutes. For hours. Albert apparently tried cutting his way through the bag that he was being carried in, but he was in such an awkward position in the bag that he couldn't get his knife out of his pocket. After a couple hours, the creature dropped him down, and he heard multiple creatures talking to each other in a weird language that he couldn't understand. At dawn, he finally mustered up the courage to struggle out of his bag and found 4 people who were, quote, covered in hair and wearing no clothes at all. Finally, he realized that the Indian guy on the boat who tried to warn him was right. These were the Sasquatches. As the sun came up, he saw that he was in a valley with mountains all around, and it became apparent to him that the 4 people were some type of Sasquatch family. According to Albert, there was, quote, an old man, old lady, and 2 young ones, a boy and a girl. These creatures didn't do anything to hurt him, but it seemed clear through their behavior that they were, as Albert put it, intent on keeping him. Interestingly, the guy in this story states that He thought that they were human, although they had almost inhuman proportions. This is a summarized quote of what Albert saw. The young fellow might have been between 11 and 18 years old, about 7 feet tall, and might weigh about 300 pounds. He had a wide jaw and a narrow forehead that slanted upward. The hair on their heads was about 6 inches long. The hair on the rest of their body was short and thick in places. The woman was over 7 feet tall. She could have weighed about 500 to 600 pounds. She had very wide hips and a goose-like walk. She was not built for beauty or speed. The man's canines were longer than the rest of his teeth, but not long enough to be called tusks. The old man must have been near 8 feet tall, big barrel chest, and a big hump on his back and shoulders. His forearms were longer than common people, but well proportioned. His fingers were short in proportion to the rest of his hands, but his fingernails were like chisels. After living with the Sasquatch family for 6 days, Albert hilariously got tired of being around them, which makes sense, considering he had basically become the family pet for this Sasquatch family. Once he decided he was going to escape, he waited until none of them were paying attention to him. He reached for his gun, fired his rifle in the air, and in doing this, he was able to startle the family enough to make a run for it and navigate back to the inlet. Albert, of course, made it out and lived to tell the tale. And after this story, I'm probably gonna think twice about going camping alone, or even at all. With this being one of the earlier and most documented and validated Sasquatch stories, the level of detail and sheer circumstance is rather questionable and definitely scary. Were the Sasquatch real? Was he kidnapped? Did he have some sort of psychedelic experience? Was it aliens? Was it all a lie? We'll likely never know. Number 3. A slip in time. In 1901, 2 English school teachers named Anne Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain were on a holiday trip in France. On this trip, they visited the historic site known as the Palace of Versailles. According to the 2 of them, they both claimed to have the exact same experience. At some point in their walk, they found themselves over 100 years back in time. They found the Petit Trianon, a small manor house given to Marie Antoinette by Louis XVI, and reportedly saw it exactly how it looked when it was new in 1792. Apparently, they had been taken back to this very specific day for a reason, because according to the school teachers, the day they were taken back to was August 10th, 1792, which was the same historic day that the royal family was forced to flee the palace. The 2 teachers claimed to have walked on historic pathways that no longer existed and saw people in old-fashioned clothing accurate to the year they were in all around them. The craziest part is that they claimed to have seen Marie Antoinette herself, who was painting in the garden. Apparently, Marie Antoinette looked up at them from the painting and just stared at them, never saying a word. The 2 teachers didn't really think much about this the day that it happened. Only upon coming back to the site years later after seeing paintings of Marie Antoinette and studying the layout of the palace, they had realized that the palace they were exploring in 1901 was not from 1901. Skeptics of this story claimed that they must have just walked into a costume party that day, but no historical record was ever found of there being a costume party on that specific day. Despite skepticism, the 2 ladies stood their ground until their death. Part of me just thinks somewhere at this museum site, there was some sort of 19th century hippie working there, and when he saw 2 school teachers getting ready for their afternoon tea, he slipped in a little Salvinorin B methyloxymethyl ether. Jokes aside, this is either the craziest thing I've ever heard or the dumbest thing I've ever heard, and there is no in between. The 2 interpretations of this story are: 1, 2 half-drunken school teachers stumbled into a Marie Antoinette costume party or some sort of play and thought that the actor playing Marie Antoinette was actually Marie Antoinette. Or secondly, 2 school teachers were walking around a historical site and accidentally walked right into the entrance of a wormhole at the exact time some type of interdimensional being opened it up to transfer time periods, sending them back past the back rooms and right into the year 1792. Then the interdimensional time traveling entity was sweating bullets because normal humans were not supposed to be able to get this back in time. So the creature had to go back to the same day, find the 2 teachers, and bring them back into the present day before they talked to the queen and ruined the entire space-time continuum. But because the women had already changed the present day due to the butterfly effect, the interdimensional entity either had to find another timeline in which the present was congruent with everything they did in 1792 and send them to the universal timeline that we exist today, where I'm telling you the story right now. And putting it that way, I'm starting to think it's just a costume party. But I do find it extremely eerie that one day you can be walking through a building and appreciating its beauty and seeing somebody you thought you recognized, only to later be looking in a history book and realize that you were in a building that was almost 200 years older than you thought, and the person you thought you recognized was Marie Antoinette. Number 4. Unidentified creatures at the mine. Before I start the story, I just want to mention that there seems to be some sort of weird correlation between mine shafts and mysterious forest creatures. This is just a theory, but I'm starting to think that special interest groups who want a certain mining territory for themselves would just put on a costume of some sort to scare away the other prospectors from thinking about working there. Either way, this next story is wild to say the least. In 1924, American miners in Ape Canyon were staying on the east side of Mount St. Helens in the state of Washington. One morning, deep in the woods, Fred Beck and his group of prospectors saw something that baffled them. Around the cabin they had just slept in, they noticed huge human-like footprints that appeared to have been walking around their cabin that night. The worst part about this is this wasn't the first time. The other times this had happened, the prospectors shrugged it off, as if maybe another crew member was playing a prank on them. I mean, other explanations just didn't make sense. Their cabin wasn't in a town, and as far as Mr. Beck knew, there wasn't anybody else around. Weird. But the men carried on with their day, trying not to think about it too much. After a couple of weeks went by with no strange occurrences to be seen, Beck and most of his crew were feeling less tense. I guess it hadn't been a big deal after all. But Beck couldn't shrug this feeling, the feeling that him and his crew were being watched. Then, one day, they were caught off guard. Sitting on a log and eating lunch, one of the men joked about his friend slipping and nearly falling on a squirrel. Beck, lost in laughter, looked to the side to catch his breath, and in an instant he froze. Cold adrenaline coursed through his head, and his stomach felt like a dagger had been plunged into it. For a split second, Beck thought it was a man, but what he processed next made him mildly dissociate for a second, and he even questioned if he was in a dream. Creepily peeking behind a tree was a huge man-like creature, but it definitely wasn't human. At least 8 feet tall and looking only partially human, it stood there, intently, silently watching them. Immediately, one single question pulsed across Beck's mind. How long has it been watching us? In only a moment, the crew had caught on to what he was looking at, and immediately froze along with him, before quickly shooting multiple shots. One of them hit the creature somewhere in the head and it ran away, seeming to be injured. Another day, Fred Beck walked up on a similar creature standing by the edge of a canyon. Getting more and more frustrated at his own growing fear, he shot the creature in the back, and it keeled over and fell off the cliff. But when the men looked down towards the bottom of the cliff to get a better look at it, they couldn't see it anywhere. That night, however, Fred would soon regret his actions, because little did Fred know that whatever those things were, they would soon seek retribution. You see, by now, most of his crew had abandoned the assignment. They came here to be surveyors and miners. Nobody was getting paid any hazard pay to risk their lives being around these mysterious half-human creatures that wouldn't stop following them. With only a few men that night in his cabin, Fred was awakened, and he wrote, quote, "At least 2 creatures attacked our cabin that night, battering the roof and walls in an attempt to break in. The creatures were able to break a hole in between 2 logs of the cabin. All the while, large thundering strikes could be heard from their rooftop in an attempt to break a hole through it. Luckily, our cabin and its roof were built strong enough to resist snowfall. Even after we made repeated shots out of the cabin hole, the creatures violently persisted, at times wedging their huge hands in between the holes in an attempt to yank our cabin walls apart. 5 hours of relentless beating on the cabin later, the creatures gave up and left the site. Outside, the prospectors found the ground torn up with huge footprints all around. After this, Fred and his crew left for good, abandoning their mine, their cabin, and the mining area entirely. Fred had a pretty high tolerance for many things throughout his life in the mining business, but this was not one of them. All in all, the series of events has never been explained, nor did Fred or his crew ever get a photo of the mysterious creature. The most plausible explanation is this was probably a remote tribe of some type, but that wouldn't explain all of their inhuman characteristics. Either way, if I was Fred, I would have been packing my bags 2 minutes after the first encounter. So props at him for carrying on with his job even after most of his crew left. I'm not sure if he's extremely brave or extremely dumb, but regardless, he's got bigger balls than me and a crazy mystery that's still unsolved. Number 5, killed by a chicken. This story really demonstrates the power belief can have on your body. Deep within the Congo in 1682, an Italian missionary named Father Jerome heard an interesting story about a man who died from his own superstition. During the missionary journey, a young local from the Congo, who we'll just call Zuri, had a sleepover with his friend. Then, in the morning, his friend caught a wild hen and and made it for breakfast. Now, for some context, according to the superstitions of the local tribes in the area, young people were absolutely forbidden to eat a wild hen. Now, back to Zuri. When he saw the chicken for breakfast, he asked his friend if it was a wild hen or a farmer's hen. Zuri's friend really didn't feel like going out to find another hen to make, so he lied to Zuri, telling him it was a farmer's hen, when in reality, it was a wild hen. Here's the crazy part. Multiple years later, when the two friends met again, Zuri's friend asked him if he wanted to eat a wild hen. Zuri said, "Are you kidding? I was solemnly warned by a magician to never eat a wild hen." The friend immediately laughed and said, "Why wouldn't you? You ate the wild hen I served you last time we hung out." Then, according to multiple reports, Zuri started shaking like Fregley after eating too many jelly beans and was dead within 24 hours. To me, this is definitely a mystery, because even when people know that they're going to die, they very rarely just keel over and die out of fear. But because he ended up dying at some point after he ate the wild hen, would that mean that the magician was actually right? Was the magic of the magician just his power to create a self-fulfilling prophecy? Either way, the magician was definitely onto something here. Or he was just some type of ancient version of a YouTube prankster who just sat around all day busting people's balls and protected himself with the imaginary power of his magic. Either way, finding out you unintentionally broke a rule to only die later that day is extremely strange and, to me, terrifying. And the fact that this situation was well documented and never solved is rather curious. Number 6. The disappearance of Emma Filippov. Emma Filipov's disappearance is definitely hard to explain. Neither she nor her explanation have been conclusively found. To be honest, this is quite a sad story. And although there are multiple ways to interpret the story, I'll let you decide at the end. Emma Filippov was born in 1986 to a family from Ontario, Canada. Her parents divorced at a young age and she was forced to frequently travel to different locations to see her mother and father. Emma was a free spirit. She enjoyed the arts, music, literature, and even took a job teaching English in China for a year as a young adult. After returning from China and unsuccessfully pursuing a career in photojournalism, she landed in British Columbia, where she got a summer job working at Redfish Bluefish restaurant while sleeping on a friend's couch. After her seasonal job ended, she bought a van and converted it into a van life style camper. Then one day, for seemingly no reason, she scrubbed her identity on social media clean, removed all traces of herself from the internet, and called off her 3-month-long relationship. Emma also had a journal in which investigators found a lot of entries about how she felt about her parents since their divorce. Through reading the entries, it became apparent that she was having a hard time dealing with the effects the divorce had on her as a child. Emma had a strained relationship with her parents after her father had an affair with a younger woman. Her mother threatened him with a knife, and Emma called the police on her own mother. Records suggest that that was the primary reason that Emma moved out of her parents' house and really didn't want to go back. Personally, I don't blame her. Now, at this point, what's confusing about Emma's story is that she decided to move into a homeless shelter for women, which, if you know anything about homeless shelters, was probably a rougher environment to live in than one of her parents' houses. What's even stranger is at this point, when she was living in British Columbia, she had enough money from her restaurant job to rent a decent apartment. But even if she didn't have that money for the apartment, she had an entire renovated van to live in. But apparently, she mostly just used it for storage. Now, nobody really knows why she did this, but some theories are that she had undiagnosed paranoia, which made her van feel unsafe. Another possible theory is that she was trying to keep her savings to travel later, which there is some evidence for. Regardless of the fact that she was able to save money at the shelter, Emma was consistently paranoid and anxious at the shelter as well. Staff members allegedly reported that one time she took the furniture and appliances out of her room because they were, quote, telling her things at night. But to be fair, these claims have been contested by others who say that the staff just wanted to portray Emma as a crazy, mentally ill individual in order to alleviate themselves of any personal responsibility. One strange thing about Emma is that it seemed as if she couldn't make her mind up about anything. For example, a couple days before her disappearance, she hired a truck driver to tow her camper van back to Ontario from British Columbia. But the day he showed up, she quickly changed her mind and claimed that she didn't have the money to do it. Then, to make matters stranger, 2 days after this, she called her mother and said she wanted to come home, urgently asking her mom to fly in and come get her. Then, just a couple hours later, she called her mom again to tell her that she changed her mind and wasn't coming home anymore, telling her mom, quote, "I don't know how to face you." Considering how ominous and vague this sentence was, Emma's mother was concerned about her daughter's seemingly erratic behavior, so she booked a flight herself that day to come and help her daughter. After this, her unusual behavior continued. For example, Emma bought a prepaid card with $200 on it and a new prepaid phone, which will tie into the story later. One decision that probably haunts both Emma's mother and the staff of the homeless shelter to this day is that Emma's mother called the women's homeless shelter and decided to let them know that she was going to visit. Then, the staff of the homeless shelter decided to tell Emma about her mother's arrival. Emma was reported to have been, quote, horrified and immediately packed up her belongings and left. Tragically, we'll never know if Emma would have been saved if either of these two decisions were never made. I'm no doctor, but in my armchair psychologist opinion, it seems that Emma possibly had PTSD, which is kind of exemplified by the frequency of her paranoia and the flare-ups of trauma that she experiences involving her parents. But that's just a theory, and I could be completely wrong. Shortly after leaving the shelter, she got in a taxi with her belongings in hand and asked to be taken to the airport, only to change her mind in the middle of the ride, once again lying that she didn't have the money for the taxi. We know this is a lie because she had just received a new credit card, and after working at a restaurant, she had $2,400 in savings, which adjusted for today's money is around $3,300. And everyone knows that that's totally enough money for a taxi, unless you're an oblivious looking tourist in Cancun getting in a taxi with Guadalupe, which at that point, you're done for. And Guadalupe, if you're watching this, please give me my $100 back. That ride from the airport to the hotel was literally like 6 minutes. Anyways, later that night, someone who knew Emma found her walking around barefoot in front of the Empress Hotel. He asked her if she was okay, and she unconvincingly told him that she was just waiting for her friend to pick her up. Dennis, who was Emma's friend, wasn't happy with this answer and thought Emma looked distressed, so he called the police. 20 minutes later, the police arrived and asked her a series of questions. It had been said that she was mostly unresponsive, not saying much and just nodding her head yes and no to the questions asked by the officers. That being said, when it became apparent that the police might take her into custody, she mustered the energy to somehow convince the police that she was totally fine after all. After the police left, she immediately walked away from the hotel area and was never seen again. Now, this case is already weird, but what happened afterwards makes the entire case even more strange. Tragically, her mother showed up to Victoria, British Columbia only 3 hours after she was last seen. And unfortunately, she still thought that Emma would be at the shelter, but the staff told her that they hadn't seen her there that day. When it was confirmed that none of her friends knew where she was declared a missing persons by the police. Remember that $200 prepaid card that Emma had bought? Well, a lead opened up when it was used at a gas station not far away. Unfortunately though, it just turned out to be some random guy who eventually confessed to have found it on the street. Later, another suspect was discovered, a man by the name of Julian Heward, who apparently had a romantic interest in Emma. Strangely though, it was confirmed that he saw Emma at 10 a.m. that day, but like everyone else, he reported Emma to have been acting unusual, because when he asked her what she was doing, she just didn't answer. After all of the leads were exhausted, the case went cold. Then, seemingly randomly, about 2 years after she disappeared, a man in a green shirt with a prosthetic leg was reported to have torn down a missing poster of Emma in a restaurant and thrown it on the floor. Right after doing this, he yelled, quote, "It's one of those missing persons posters, except she is not missing. She's my girlfriend, and she ran away because she hates her parents." The staff immediately called the police, who arrived 2 hours later. And to this day, the best possible lead for this case has never been identified. Another interesting piece of the puzzle is that 6 years after her disappearance, a man named William came forward with a confession that after Emma was last seen, he picked her up from the side of the road because it was raining and he wanted to help her. Upon request, he gave her a ride to Colwood, a town that was nearby to the hotel area where she was last seen. William told police that she had requested him to take her there to meet a friend. If this story is true, it would make William the last person to have ever seen Emma, but it also means that Emma didn't go missing in the area of the Empress Hotel, but somewhere in Colwood. Overall, this is a truly sad disappearance and is still currently unsolved. If you have any leads or want to contribute to the search, there's actually still multiple online communities for you to help in, with one of them being Help Find Emma Filipoff on Facebook or r/Find Emma Filipoff on Reddit. With that being said, I hope Emma is found safely soon. I really hate to end this video on such an upsetting note, but I did say this video got scarier as it went on. I guess the silver lining is that there is still hope in the Emma Filipoff case. With that being said, that's going to conclude our first ever video on unsolved mysteries. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the small variety of strange entities, strange occurrences, disappearances, and missing items. I tried to keep this video diverse, and I tried to keep it interesting too, with stories that I haven't heard before. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and if you want more videos on unsolved mysteries, I'd be happy to do it. And if you'd like this video, why not watch this video about what war was like in every time period? It's a pretty good watch. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, trust me, bro. who left this little random baby in the park? How you doing, little guy? Are you okay?
Why are you so ugly? You look ugly and you look stupid.
Funny, yeah, well, at least my parents didn't ditch me in the woods, so yeah, enjoy eating rocks for dinner. Peace out. When you think of kids, you probably think of cuteness, innocence, and maybe brutal honesty. But one thing you probably don't think about is evil. Well, in this video, I'm gonna be talking about kids that did evil things, and whether or not it's my place to say if someone is truly evil or not, I don't know. But what I do know is that everything I'm about to mention that these kids did was definitely evil. Now let's get into it. Starting off our list, we have Josh Phillips, who was only 14 years old when he committed his evil act. Phillips grew up in Pennsylvania, but he was moved to Florida with his mother and abusive drug-addicted father. One very important and interesting detail about the story is that there was absolutely no signs that Phillips could potentially be capable of what he ended up doing, at least none that were reported. He was described as quiet and friendly by neighbors in Florida. The mother of Josh's victim even said that her daughter and Josh were good friends and she had no reason to be scared of him. Teachers even described him as a popular kid who didn't stand out, and he had no prior criminal history. So what exactly did Josh do to end up on the list of most evil kids? According to Phillips, on November 3rd, 1998, he was home alone when Maddie Clifton, who lived across the street from Phillips, came to his house asking him to come outside and play baseball. Phillips agreed even though he knew he wasn't allowed to hang out with friends when his parents weren't home. As the two were playing baseball, according to Phillips, he hit Clifton's eye, causing her to bleed, cry, and scream. Phillips panicked knowing that his father would come home soon and he was fearing his reaction. Phillips dragged Clifton into the house saying that her clothes came off as he dragged her into the house, and then he hit her in the head with the baseball bat to stop her from screaming before putting her under the base of his bed. When Josh's dad came home, he chatted with him for a bit and then went back to his room to see that Maddie was still alive in his bed. He at that point removed the mattress and then stabbed her 7 times with a knife, killing her. Maddie's disappearance was reported 5 p.m. that day, and there was a 6-day-long search looking for her, which Phillips participated in. I think one of the most unfortunate parts about the story, besides the absolute tragedy of Maddie Clifton's death, is the fact that Phillips' mother was the one to discover the body in his bed when she was cleaning his room and noticed a wet spot. Prosecutors have a few issues with the story that Josh told, specifically being that it is very unlikely that her clothes came off when he dragged her into the house because there was no dirt on or around her clothes, and the fact that there was no blood on the bat or in the backyard, making his story have almost no validity, and unfortunately, we will probably never know the real story. Moving on, we have Edmund, or Ed Kemper. Kemper was born on December 18th, 1948 in Burbank, California, and he committed his atrocious act at only 15 years old. At least the first of his atrocious acts, but we'll get there. On August 27th, 1964, Kemper was sitting at the kitchen table with his grandmother when they unfortunately had an argument. Angered, Kemper stormed off and grabbed his rifle that his grandfather had given him for hunting. He re-entered the kitchen and shot his grandmother in the face once and then shooting her twice more in the back. Kemper then waited for his grandfather to return home from grocery shopping, where he shot him in the face in the driveway. At this point, Kemper didn't know what to do, so he called his mother and she told him to call the police, which he did, and he waited to be arrested. When in custody, Ed shockingly reported that he just wanted to see what it would feel like to kill grandma. If it hasn't already become obvious yet, this video is pretty dark and it's only gonna get darker, so buckle up. Kemper was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic and was sent to the criminally insane unit of the state hospital, where he shockingly only served 5 years. Kemper was able to be released so early because he was able to convince his psychiatrist that he was rehabilitated, and he was released on his birthday, December 18th, 1969, which to me is criminally negligent knowing what I'm about to discuss. If you had any hope that Kemper was successfully rehabilitated, I am extremely sorry to burst your bubble, but that is simply not the case. Upon his freedom, Kemper decided to viciously murder 6 women and even kept their heads as trophies. He then killed his own mother and his friend, and at that point turned himself back into the police. He says that his justification for the killing spree was that he wanted to get revenge on his abusive mother, and now that that was complete, his job was done. This kid was definitely evil. Now, before I mention this next evil child, there's one thing I want to make very clear. It's probably not a surprise that I read a lot of news to make these videos, and no matter how critically I try to think about things, no one is immune to bias and one-sided articles, which is exactly why I want to give a huge thank you to our first ever sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from across the political spectrum and across the world on a single news story, and gives you a breakdown of the media outlet's political bias, reliability rating, and ownership, all backed by 3 independent news monitoring organizations. And you can check them out for yourself at ground.news/trustmebro. The link's in the description and the pinned comment. Let's take a look at this kind of funny example on raw duck smuggling to see exactly how it works. Ground News shows that there are 18 articles that have been published about this recently, with the majority majority of the sources coming from a center-leaning view, which makes sense because duck smuggling isn't too controversial. What I find really useful and sometimes funny is the ability to skim through headlines to see exactly how different publications are reporting on the same story. For example, with the duck smuggling, on the left they're saying 6 charged for smuggling raw duck and goose intestines under packaged rattlesnakes. Okay, but on the right they're saying 6 arrested in illegal goose intestine import scheme. It's the same story, but those headlines make it sound completely different. If you're like me and value context and transparency, I would highly encourage you start thinking critically about the news that you consume and go to ground.news/trustmebro today. Click the link in the description to get 30% off their Ultimate Access Vantage subscription, or just try out their Pro plan for less than $1 a month. Now on to our next evil kid. That being Graham Young, also known as the serial poisoner in England. Born in London on September 7th, 1947, Young's obsession with poison and poisoning things began at a very young age, and unfortunately, that obsession was able to flourish and develop as it took a while for people to catch on. Young used his family and even classmates as lab rats for his poisons, all of which made them extremely sick, but didn't kill them yet. Graham's preferred method of delivering this poison was in his victims' food and drink, a very unsuspecting place. Graham's first official murder took place on April 26, 1962. Yes, Easter Sunday. Graham's stepmother passed away shortly after drinking some tea that Young had added chemicals to. Fortunately, some of his teachers and even his own aunt grew suspicious of him and called the police. Young was arrested, and at the age of 14, while being detained at the Broadmoor Hospital, he pledged guilty to 3 non-fatal poisonings and even admitted to killing his own stepmother with poison. Now, unfortunately, similar to Ed Kemper, because Young was held at a mental institution, his stay was rather short, serving less than 9 years. And upon his release, he went on to poison 70 more people, killing 2 of them. Young was once again arrested on November 21st, 1971, where he was ultimately sent to jail, where he eventually died of a heart attack. Was he poisoned? Nobody knows, but it's a happy thought. Following this serial poisoner, we have a trio of evil children, those being Paul Gingrich, Chase Williams, and Colt Lundy. 15-year-old high school freshman Colt Lundy, with the help of 2 of his friends, shot his stepfather in the chest 4 times, killing him. Lundy's friends and co-conspirators were 12-year-old Chase Williams, who was on lookout during the evil act, and 12-year-old Paul Gingrich, who also shot Lundy's stepfather. One of the craziest parts of the story is why they killed him. Was he an abusive drunk? Was he the worst father ever? Well, according to the boys, they just wanted to run away, and they felt the need to kill him so he wouldn't catch them and get mad at them. That is definitely some 12-year-old logic. Another crazy detail is that Paul Gingrich, at only 12 years old, was the youngest person ever to be tried as an adult and was served 25 years. Lundy received 30 years, and Chase, who stayed outside on watch, got 6 years in a juvenile corrections facility. What all of these boys did was evil, but do I believe that all of these boys were evil? I'm not sure. But it definitely seems that the older boy was a negative influence, to say the least. Next up, we have David Brahm. Similar to Ed Kemper, David Brahm's evil act was triggered by a simple argument. But as we learned with Ed Kemper, an argument can turn vile. And unfortunately, that's exactly the case with David Brahm as well. Around 11:30 p.m. on the night of February 17th, 1988, Brahm had gotten into an argument with his dad once again about the music he was listening to. For Brahm, this was the final straw, and the next morning, Brahm took an axe to his father, and is shockingly reported saying that his father kept getting up and he had to keep hitting him to keep him down. So that's it, right? He just killed his dad because he was mad at him. Unfortunately not. Immediately after killing his father, he then killed his mother and 11-year-old brother and younger sister, all with that same axe. Now, weirdly, but also fortunately, hours later, Brahm asked a female classmate to skip class with him, which she did, and during their time together, he confessed everything to her. He then turned himself in, where he was arrested and sentenced to 53 years in prison. I really don't think that there's any debate on whether or not this 16-year-old who murdered his entire immediate family with an axe was evil or not. Up next, and our second last entry on the list, is Kipland Kip Kinkle, a seriously twisted individual. Kinkle never liked school and performed very poorly, and even had to repeat the first grade and was eventually diagnosed with a learning disability. But that is absolutely no excuse for the evil acts he committed. By only the 8th grade, Kipland was hiding guns in his bedroom and was caught ordering books on how to make bombs and even shoplifting. But these acts are going to seem like child's play when I tell you about the true evil that he committed shortly after. On May 20th, 1988, 15-year-old Kipling was arrested and expelled from his high school in Springfield, Oregon, after a stolen gun was found in his locker. That night, after returning home from being interrogated by the police, the teenager pulled a gun from his secret stash and killed both of his parents. And if the story ended there, it would be a very gruesome tale, but unfortunately, that's only the beginning of the story. The next morning, Kipling brought his entire gun collection to school and opened fire in the cafeteria, killing 2 students and injuring 25 more. Some rather heroic students were able to control the situation until police arrived, and disturbingly, while questioned, Kipling said that he heard voices in his head instructing him to kill, and that he himself wanted to die. He is now serving an 111-year sentence. Truly an evil individual. Our final entry on this list is maybe one of the most shocking because of how recent it was and also because of how young this evil child was. In 2007, a very young 8-year-old Amarjit Sada claimed the title of the world's youngest serial killer. Sada was born in a small poor village in India in 1998. In 2006, Sada killed his 6-month-old sister, who was left at a primary school to be taken care of while his mother was running errands. Sada took her out of her crib at the school and brutally murdered her and buried her in a shallow grave, and then later returned home like nothing happened. When questioned by adults whether or not he did such a thing, he freely and proudly admitted to this evil doing and even brought people to the grave. He was arrested and when questioned by police, simply smiled and asked for cookies. There isn't much more known about this truly terrifying and tragic case, but one of the most scary elements about it is that he was only sentenced to 3 years under Indian law, and he is now free to live his life however he pleases. I understand he was only 8 years old, but that sort of evil activity in a person needs to be monitored long term. But for now, that's all from me. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and let me know what you guys think. Were these kids evil, or were they just simply a victim of their circumstance? To me, it seems like there's a lot of elements at play, but it never justifies their actions. Thank you guys so much for watching, and also thank you Ground News for sponsoring this video. I know the Trust Me Bros are very supportive of creators getting that bag, so I appreciate you guys watching the integration and maybe even checking them out. That's all for this video. Until next time, trust me, bro. What it was like to be rich throughout every era of history. The Stone Age. In the Stone Age, wealth was measured in terms of resources and survival capabilities almost solely. To be considered rich, one would need an abundance of essential resources such as food, tools, and materials for shelter and clothing, which at the time primarily consisted of wood, animal pelts, organic materials such as large leaves, and essentially sticks and dirt. Possessing skills in hunting, gathering, and toolmaking would also be extremely valuable. On top of that, forming strong social bonds and alliances within one's tribe or community would enhance access to resources and collective security. What this means is the more friends you had, the more people that you had to potentially help and protect you if things got wild, which back in the Stone Age, they did a lot. Accumulating and managing resources like animal hides for clothes, flint for tools, and a steady food supply through effective hunting and foraging were a key to thriving in this era, and was truly the key of becoming and staying rich or wealthy, which, if it isn't already obvious, just means to be alive. Your survival was your wealth, as that was all there was to look forward to. If you could survive another day and you had the resources to make it through that day successfully, you were well off. It goes without saying that there wasn't necessarily coinage in the Stone Age, at least not in the early Stone Age, and as far as the absolute origin of money, that is still something that is not fully known or understood. But during the Stone Age, possessing skills and having access to practical life-enabling resources was the pinnacle of wealth. During the Stone Age, if you had a cozy cave that you could call your own, you had a few pelts to wrap around your naked, hairy, stinky body, you had basic flint and obsidian tools to catch little critters, and you had a good group of friends that you could eat rocks with, you were set. But not just set, you were also wealthy. Just picture it now. Not a phone in sight. Just you, all of your best boys wearing small loincloths, hitting each other over the head with big wooden clubs, just being in the moment. Sounds pretty good to me. The Bronze Age. No, not LeBron's age, the Bronze Age. Not to be confused with LeBron James, I'm talking about the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age took place between 1330 BC and 1200 BC and signified a large leap in civilization for a few reasons, most notably the production of bronze. This era, while short compared to the Stone Age, which literally lasted millions of years, had significant technological advancements, which propelled society massively. If you're unfamiliar, all bronze is melted down tin with a larger amount of melted down copper. This alloy was easy to produce and readily available, and the production of this alloy and subsequently the tools made from it allowed for rapid development in both agriculture and warfare. With that being said, what did it look like to be rich, and how was wealth measured during the Bronze Age? During this time, wealth began to be associated with the control and production of bronze. Being rich meant that you had access to these metal ores and the knowledge of crafting weapons, tools, and other ornaments. Trade became more prominent, so establishing strong trade networks and engaging in commerce was also a massive way to improve your wealth. These were some of the earliest economies ever. Additionally, owning agricultural land and livestock, which were crucial for food and trade, would signify wealth. Similar to the Stone Age, both of these are directly tied with life. Now, for almost the first time, social status was also playing a role with your wealth, with leaders often amassing wealth through tribe control over resources. So what exactly did it look like to be rich? Well, during the Bronze Age, we saw some of the earliest civilizations. So with that, we would see villages and larger communities living in one place. With that being said, if you were wealthy, you obviously had a nicer place or a larger place or potentially in a prime piece of the community, closer to the water or the farm. Besides that, we also saw irrigation agriculture, which basically means bringing the water to your crops. So if you were wealthy at this time, your farm that you had control or access to had an irrigation system built into it for convenience. And similar to the Bronze Age, if you had a good, strong network of people that you could trade with and access to tools and knowledge on how to build tools, you were pretty well off. Just imagine you and all your friends wearing slightly more animal pelts in a bigger group of people with a nice farm and a slightly bigger mud hut made with actual wood and nicer materials. You guys are all sitting around the forge making bronze swords and whatnot. Seems like a cool time. In ancient Sumeria, during the Bronze Age, one of the earliest known currencies was actually grain. Grain was used as a popular method of trade. Besides grain, there has been some mysterious clay tokens that have been suspected to be used as a means of trade. And then, as the Bronze Age continues, silver becomes a very popular means of currency, and then later after that, gold as well. So without getting too far into the weeds, during the Bronze Era, if you had a lot of social status, access to both land, agriculture, and animals, if you had a prime plot of real estate, and you had a steady supply of bronze and you knew how to make good tools, you were really well off. And then on top of that, if you had a large supply of silver and gold, then you were rich. The Iron Age. The Iron Age is a bit of an interesting era because at this point you might think that it was simply caused of pure evolution and innovation, and up until this point everything's just been linear progress, but that's actually not the case. And during the Bronze Age, at least near the very end of the Bronze Age, there was multiple significant factors happening that caused a huge decline in production, literacy, trade routes, wealth, and overall progress for humans as a whole. And the very end of the Bronze Era and the beginning of the Iron Age was actually considered more or less of a dark time in humanity. The Bronze Age was more or less of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of deal. And with the beginning of the Iron Age, we see almost more or less of a redo of the Bronze Age, but obviously with a new metal. We have iron, a much more valuable and a much stronger material. Following the same trend, however, the Iron Age was shorter than the Bronze Age simply because technological advancements took place quicker and humans were able to evolve more rapidly, even after the setbacks. With that being said, being wealthy in the Iron Age wasn't much different than being wealthy in the Bronze Age, as a lot of the same customs and traditions existed and the same means of production and wealth accumulation were in play. In the Iron Age, wealth was closely tied to the possession and production of iron, similar to bronze in the Bronze Age. Mastery of ironworking techniques to create durable tools and weapons provided a significant advantage to anyone looking to become truly wealthy. Rich individuals or communities would control iron deposits and forges, facilitating trade with military strength, either from their own community or even other communities. Agricultural advancements continued to be important, so owning and controlling fertile land and livestock remained to be a very prominent sign of wealth. Power and influence were also consolidated through warfare and alliances, with wealthy individuals holding positions of authority and accumulating wealth through tribute and trade. The Iron Age still yet didn't have coinage, and a lot of wealth was held in gold nuggets, gold sheets, gold ornaments, gold jewelry, fertile land, livestock, access to iron production, and access to military power and influence. The medieval era, aka the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. This era took place immediately after the fall of the Roman Empire, beginning in 476 AD, and lasted for roughly 1,000 years until 1400 AD. During this time, wealth had become a lot more multifaceted and also more centralized on your connection with the powers that be. Besides the king and other royalty, the richest members of society in medieval times were the nobility and merchants. The richest of merchants were those who engaged in long-distance trade, specifically of luxury goods such as spices, silk, and precious metals, all of which were extreme signs of wealth. And although the levels of wealth between nobles varied quite significantly, the richest of nobles were those that controlled the most amount of land and had the closest connections to the monarch. Regardless of noble or merchant, at the top of each of these levels, life was pretty similar. These individuals would have their own dedicated castles, fully staffed with servants. They would have large estates and farms that would be maintained by peasants and serfs. They would have luxury goods such as expensive dyes, luxurious silk clothing, expensive gold jewelry, and access to an almost unlimited supply of food and entertainment of many varieties, if you catch my drift. On top of this, the richest in society also had access to great education, something that was still a large rarity for a majority of the population. This includes reading, writing, literature, and access to other scholarly texts. Now, with this being said, if you were rich in this time period, you had an amazing opportunity to live a life of leisure and luxury. But although that wasn't the case for many people, and the wealth gap during the Middle Ages was severe. Now, with that being said, it wasn't all fine and dandy for the rich of this time, because no matter what your financial status was during this time, you were still susceptible to disease, famine, and war. Just picture it. You're hanging out with all your boys. You're in your castle with torches everywhere. Your servant just brought you a big leg of lamb, and you all are drinking out of gem-encrusted solid gold goblets. You all cheers and spill wine on your expensive silk shirts, but you don't even care because you're so rich. You have a guy in a silly hat come do a dance for you, and then you go to bed and do it all again the next day. Seems pretty cool to me. But let's move on. The early modern era. Bros, we are getting extremely close to the modern era, but we're not quite there yet. We are currently in the early modern era, which takes place roughly from 1500 AD to 1800 AD. And this era of time is likely one of the most influential eras when it comes to the structure of the world that we live in today. Let me explain. In the early modern era, wealth was driven by exploration, trade, and colonization. Nations and individuals who invested in voyages reaped enormous profits from new trade routes and new resources. Merchants and bankers accumulated wealth through the large global trade of goods like spices, textiles, and precious metals. The rise of capitalism and establishment of joint stock companies allowed for the pooling of resources and the sharing of risks and rewards. Owning land and engaging in agriculture still continued to be important, but the growing influence of commerce, finance, and manufacturing marked a significant shift on how wealth was perceived and earned in the early modern day. Up until this point, all it really took to be rich was having a cow, having a little bit of dirt to your name, and maybe a few shekels. Well, not even shekels, literally just bits of silver and having the right friends. But as we got into the early modern era, a lot of things seemed to change. We saw early globalization, early capitalism, early colonization, and the basis for the society that we all live in today. This was a pretty influential and pretty important 300-year run, in my opinion. And with that being said, what did it look like to be rich in the early modern era? Well, honestly, a lot more of the same. Bigger houses, more loot, more money, more connections, more food, more entertainment, bigger boats, more security. The biggest difference was the means of accumulating these resources. And if you were the type of person to be going on these conquests or voyages, then your life was extremely hectic, spending months or even years at sea to potentially come home empty-handed or never even come home at all. People were just playing Assassin's Creed Black Flag in real life. With that being said, everything was just sunshine and rainbows, right? Definitely not. Like, at all. But we're talking about being rich, so yeah, being rich was pretty awesome almost all the time. And in the early modern era, we saw for almost the first time how being wealthy started to shift. The modern era. And just like that, in the last 11 and a half minutes, we went from millions of years ago in the Stone Age to the modern day. Now, the modern era is kind of blended into the early modern era, so there's no exact start date, but for the sake of this video, we'll consider it from 1800 until present day. In the modern era, wealth has been increasingly associated with industrialization, innovation, and finance. The Industrial Revolution transformed transformed economies, creating vast fortunes for those who owned factories, mines, and railways. In the contemporary world, wealth is often derived from investments in technology, real estate, and financial markets. Entrepreneurs and business owners who innovate and scale their business can achieve substantial wealth. Education and knowledge has become a critical asset, and advanced degrees and specialized skills open doors to lucrative careers. Globalization and digital technologies such as the internet have further expanded opportunities for wealth creation across diverse sectors and regions. I would say that the world we live in today is pretty great, and we enjoy a lot of modern luxuries, and we have so many amazing opportunities right at our fingertips. Never before has the world been so decentralized, meaning that anybody has the opportunity to do great things. Whereas in the past, if you were a serf or a peasant working on a noble's farm, you had almost zero chance of being anything more than that. With that being said, in the modern day, especially as in present day, the amount of opportunities of getting wealthy thanks to the internet is almost limitless. But even at the beginning of the modern era, near the Industrial Revolution, opportunities were starting to present themselves everywhere. And obviously we got off to a rough start with extreme amounts of child labor, including chimney sweeps, factory workers, and a lot of horrible stuff that definitely isn't great, but got a lot of people rich. With that being said, what does it look like to be rich in the modern day? Well, fortunately, I don't think I have to paint too much of a crazy picture for you guys. And honestly, I think in the modern day, wealth is really what you make of it. Because of the vast amount of opportunities, it can be whatever you want it to be. If you have enough money to sustain yourself, then your wealth could look like living in a van that you own and have enough money coming in on a monthly basis to maintain your lifestyle. Or it could look like the biggest mansion full of the craziest watches and cars and gold doubloons. Now, for a generalization, the rich of today typically enjoy compounding interest with their investments, a good portfolio of real estate, freedom of time by having tasks delegated through their employees, and freedom of location and time, meaning that they can work where they want, when they want. That is, if they want to. Now, one thing I will say, bros, is that I just tried to sum up millions of years of history in under 15 minutes, so if something doesn't sound fully right, just remember, trust me, bro. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I had a lot of fun making it, and I felt like it's been too long since I made a history-based video. So let me know what you guys thought, and if you guys have any ideas for other interesting videos like this, please leave them down in the comments. Thank you guys so much for watching, and like always, trust me, bro. How the most infamous serial killers were caught. The date is April 16th, 1975. You are Sergeant Bob Hayward, a Utah Highway Patrol officer doing his nightly patrol. You're driving up and down suburban roads thinking about this crazy shark movie that just came out called Jaws. When all of a sudden, you notice something peculiar. You see a tan 1968 Volkswagen Beetle parked outside of a house at 3 a.m. Reasonably, this looks suspicious to you, so you take a closer look. However, as you approach the vehicle, they speed off. You pursue this vehicle, and fortunately, you're able to pull it over. This person was obviously up to no good, and you don't know what you're walking up to. You exit your cruiser and walk towards the vehicle with your gun drawn. Deep down, you're terrified, and you just hope that the other person is more terrified than you are. You command the driver to get out of the Beetle, and they comply. They apologize and say that they were just up late watching a movie in the drive-in theater. However, the movie the suspect claimed they had seen at the drive-in wasn't playing at the drive-in, and you knew that, which made you suspicious enough to check their vehicle. A decision that likely has a significant impact on the course of history. During the search of your vehicle, you find a lot of things, and it seems that they only get more and more grim. You find gloves, pantyhose, ripped sheets, rope, a flashlight, a ski mask, an ice pick, trash bags, and handcuffs. Things that normal people don't keep in their vehicle. Although possessing these items and keeping them in your car is suspicious, it's not a crime. However, fortunately, you were able to still bring this suspect in for evading an officer. You collect information about your suspect and you realize that his name is Ted Bundy, a name that you will soon never forget. Ted wasn't in jail long as he was freed on bond, but your findings in his vehicle were enough to get you talking, specifically to your fellow officers. You speak to detectives at your station about this encounter, and they too find the description of this Volkswagen Beetle and the name Bundy oddly familiar. It's at this point when the detectives in Utah contact investigators in Washington, where they learn that this weird Bundy guy was on their very short list of murder suspects in a series of murders. Coincidentally, however, the murders that took place in Washington stopped as soon as Bundy left and relocated from Washington to Utah. And coincidentally as well, disappearances then started to begin in Utah. If alarm bells weren't already ringing, they were now off the chain. If you're watching this video, I'm assuming it's no spoiler that Ted Bundy is one of the most notorious serial killers of all time. His unbelievably depraved actions are the reason we still talk about him to this day as a cautionary tale. Let me quickly summarize his methods. Ted Bundy was a wolf in sheep's clothing, always hidden in plain sight. Although Although he was an active serial killer, he was working within the justice system and was even present on his own crime scenes. Not only that, but he had an unassuming character. He was considered handsome, looked and acted normal, and was considered charming by some. And he more so fit the description of a model citizen than a serial killer, which is one of the biggest reasons why he was able to go on for so long without being caught. It's actually quite upsetting to know how many pretty obvious clues were ignored by the police simply because they just didn't assume Ted was the type of guy to do that, which is obviously why you should never judge a book by its cover. Ted Bundy was a very methodical killer, with a system that he had down to a science. Ted preyed on primarily young white women. He would typically lurk around colleges and universities where he could easily find his next victim. But he usually wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was directly in your face and would approach women, typically in an arm sling or crutches to appear helpless and to gain sympathy points from the woman, and he would ask random women if they would be able to help him either put books in his car or something along those lines. Basically any lie to get the women to believe that they're helping a helpless, kind gentleman do something in or around his car. And if these kind women did make it to his vehicle, chances were it was basically done for them. At this point, Ted would bludgeon these women, typically to the point of unconsciousness or even death, and then do a multitude of things, typically engaging in on top of mutilating the body in ways that I can't even begin to explain, such as cutting off the victim's head and keeping it as a trophy and taking pictures with his victims as a sort of twisted, happy memory. And then once he felt he was done, he would dump the body somewhere, typically in multiple pieces. But even then, in some instances, he wasn't done, as there is cases where he would go back to visit these bodies he had dumped multiple times. Ted Bundy was extremely twisted, but fortunately, this video is focused on justice. And in this case, justice was served, albeit much later than it should have been. The string of murders committed by Ted Bundy had been going on for years at this point. But on November 8th, 1974, 1 year before his run-in with the police at the beginning of this segment, Bundy kidnapped a woman that would soon become his downfall. He picked up this 18-year-old woman from the Fashion Place Mall outside of Salt Lake City, Utah. And of course, he had devious intentions. But unlike many before her, she was able to escape, saving her life. Over 1 year later, on October 2nd in 1975, only 2 months after the run-in with the police, this same woman picked Bundy out of a lineup in the police station, confirming that this man was the man who kidnapped her 1 year prior. And this one positive ID in this one police lineup was able to bring this entire thing to justice, as 1 year later, on March 1st, 1976, Bundy was found guilty for kidnapping and sentenced up to 15 years. Obviously, Bundy did much worse than kidnapping, but this was a start. And for him, he saw this as the beginning of the end. But if you think this is the conclusion of how Ted Bundy got caught, you're definitely mistaken, because this is only the first of many times this man was caught. In 1977, another year later, Bundy was extradited to Colorado for the murder of one of his victims, which was progress in terms of justice. But during this time, he escaped from a second-story window when he was left alone for only a few moments. He spent 6 days living in the wild outside of the prison in Aspen and was then found and taken back into custody. However, only a few months later, he escaped from his jail cell in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. And things took a dark turn once again. Bundy wasn't living in the woods for 6 days. He was on the run for months, and during this time, he would attack 5 people and kill 3 of them. And by people, I mean young, innocent women. On February 15th, 1978, another officer spotted a stolen vehicle around 1:30 a.m. in Pensacola, Florida, and decided to pursue this vehicle. Once again, Bundy was taken into custody, and this officer didn't even know the level of monster that he had in the back of his cruiser. When Bundy was brought to the police station, he refused to say his name for over 2 days. A detective was able to get him to confess that his name was Theodore Chapman Bundy, but for some reason the detective didn't connect the dots and realize that this was Ted Bundy, the serial killer that was currently on the loose. Fortunately, this mistake wasn't extremely consequential, as they did shortly after connect the dots. And on July 24th, 1979, Ted Bundy was convicted on 2 counts of murder. Although while he was in custody, he admitted to over 30 murders, and there is suspected to be even more, although those are not confirmed. On January 24th, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed at Florida State Prison at the age of 42. So now, if somebody asks you, how did Ted Bundy get caught? Not only do you know the answer, but now you know to ask, well, which time? The time he was first brought into custody for acting suspicious, the time that he ran away from the courthouse and was in the trees for 6 days and then was caught and brought back, the time that he broke out of prison with a hacksaw and was on another killing rampage for 2 months before being brought back. There's a few times he was caught, but in all seriousness, my description of this case only scratches the surface, and even the process of how he was caught and his court chronicles, where he not only represented himself but also proposed to his girlfriend at the time in court. There's a lot of lore to this story, and if you want to learn more about it, I actually have a video that goes specifically in depth on on these serial killers, which I'll put at the end of the video. Bundy was executed via the electric chair with crowds watching as he perished, and his final words were a message of love for his family and friends, if he even had any left. The year is 1978. You're a police officer in Ohio. It's Friday night and you just started your shift. Due to a new safe driving initiative, you're tasked with field sobriety tests. And so far, your night is uneventful. A car drives up to your cruiser and stops. You look inside the vehicle and it's a young man. An awkward looking one at that. He and the car both seem normal, but you get an odd vibe. You ask him if he'd been drinking and awkwardly, he says no. He doesn't seem drunk, just strange. And to alleviate your discomfort, you let him go. Little did you know, the person that you just spoke with wasn't any ordinary teenager. You just stopped one of the most infamous serial killers of all time. Not only that, he had the body of his first victim in the car with him. You had just let go Jeffrey Dahmer. If this police officer had potentially acted more so on his strange feeling and looked around more, potentially one of the most infamous and disgusting serial killers would have been caught a lot sooner. But unfortunately, this early encounter was uneventful and marked the beginning of his disgusting killing spree. Jeffrey Dahmer, similar to Ted Bundy, was a rather unassuming serial killer who was social, active in the community, likable, and for those reasons, able to operate almost directly under the nose of the police for way longer than he ever should have been able to. Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't a particularly brilliant serial killer who crossed all of his T's and dotted all of his I's. If you're familiar with how he committed his murders and what he did after the fact, there was a lot of opportunities for evidence to be found and dots to be connected, and unfortunately, the police took way too long to connect those dots. Jeffrey Dahmer's father was an analytical chemist, which may seem unassuming but led to a morbid curiosity that ended up consuming Jeffrey Dahmer's life. Jeffrey's father taught him how to preserve animal bones with bleach, and they would even look around their property together to find dead animals to dissect and preserve and bleach the skin and connective tissue of these dead animals. Jeffrey's father thought he was sharing insight into his career with potentially interesting information, but to Jeffrey, this information was highly interesting, and unfortunately, it was taking in a completely wrong direction, which we'll get into. On top of this weird dissection and scientific process, if you want to call it that, Jeff showed signs of trauma in his younger years, specifically torturing animals and being rather quiet and reserved. His father even admitted that there were signs that he didn't notice at the time, which is questionable. After graduating high school, Dahmer attended a party, something he did relatively often as he tried his best to be social and was at this point already experiencing a rather nasty alcohol addiction. On the way home after this party, Jeffrey picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, another 18-year-old man. They both went back to Dahmer's place to hang out and drink, and while Stephen didn't have any sort of romantic intentions, Jeffrey did. And when Jeffrey got the clue that things likely weren't going to happen, he took matters into his own hands in the worst way possible. Dahmer grabbed a dumbbell and hit this man over the head, knocking him unconscious. He then strangled the man and then assaulted his body for his own personal satisfaction. And then at that point, used what he had been practicing on animals on a person for the first time. And unfortunately, this was not the only time either. After mutilating and dismembering the body, Dahmer packed it into his car where he was driving to dispose of it. And it was on this drive where Dahmer met the police officer. If only this police officer chose to do a search, we would be living in a much different timeline. But unfortunately, that was not the case. And although Dahmer was caught, he was not caught then. And after this instance, he was able to kill and hurt many more people. At the age of 19, Dahmer got involved in the military, where he was suspected to have done unsavory things with soldiers and was kicked out at the age of 22. After this, he began his hand in the professional world, where he was unsuccessful in holding a steady job due to his alcohol abuse. He started exposing himself to women and children at playgrounds, where he was caught and charged for indecent exposure, although this will be one of his most tame convictions we touch on in this entire video. Dahmer's sadistic urges were beginning to take a hold of him, and he was back on the hunt, looking for control. It was around this time in his early 20s where Dahmer began frequenting bathhouses and gay bars, where he would meet men, hang out, and then take control, to put it in his words. Dahmer was most commonly drinking these men that he was meeting under the table, and due to his high alcohol tolerance, the people that he was with were unable to keep up and likely would pass out before Jeffrey was even feeling a buzz. In these instances, Jeffrey would take advantage of these people, but even with how manipulative and horrible this is still only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Jeffrey Dahmer. He wasn't really convicted for any of these unwanted touchings, but he did get a 1-year probationary sentence for indecent exposure once again. In 1987, Dahmer knew that indecent exposure and drugging and assaulting men just wasn't enough, and he felt that he needed to get back to his old ways. Dahmer said that this second murder in the beginning of this next chapter of serial killings was actually an accident. He said he just woke up in a hotel with a dead person beside him. And even if that was true, any normal person would at that point call the police. But of course, that's not what Jeff did. Dahmer stuffed this person into a suitcase and took him out of the hotel. He took this body back to his grandmother's house, where he dismembered it, assaulted the body, and cut this person's head off and boiled it to keep the skull for his own personal use, to say the least. This trend would continue drugging, assaulting, and killing men over the next years. I know I've already gotten into detail, but there is so many disgusting and gruesome details associated with exactly what Jeffrey Dahmer would do to his victims, and there is a ton of videos about that. So let's focus in on the point of this video. Jeffrey Dahmer killed 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. But how exactly did he get caught? Well, as he continued his spree, he got less and less cautious and more hasty, as he simply cared less and less and was too caught up in his own fantasies, it seemed. On July 22nd, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer lured a man named Tracy Edwards into his apartment, offering to pay him $100 for nude photographs. When they got to the apartment, that's when things started to go wrong. Dahmer attempted to handcuff this man and threatened him with a knife, and Edward smartly played along, trying to keep Dahmer calm and unassuming of him trying to escape. After spending 5 hours together, Tracy was able to punch Dahmer in the face and flee, getting out of the apartment and onto the street, where he flagged down 2 police officers. At this point, Tracy was barely clothed and still had a handcuff on his wrist. The police followed Tracy back to Dahmer's apartment, where Dahmer admitted to putting handcuffs on this man, but doing nothing wrong. However, the police weren't satisfied with that answer and searched the apartment, which is when one of the officers discovered Polaroid photographs of dismembered bodies. And after seeing this evidence, the police handcuffed Dahmer after a bit of a power struggle. A search that took place later on uncovered a collection of human remains and other vile things that I won't even get into. Dahmer confessed to all of the murders and waived his right to a lawyer during his interrogations. And over a 2-week span, detectives were able to get Dahmer to admit to his crimes and detail them specifically. And in detail, he outlined 17 murders of men and boys between 1978 and 1991. The following year, on January 13th, 1992, Dahmer pled guilty but insane to 15 counts of murder. Dahmer wasn't sentenced to death in the court system, but he was by another inmate. And during his time serving 15 consecutive life sentences, he was beaten to death with a blunt object by another inmate. Some people thought this was a poetic ending to his reign of terrors, while others didn't think that this was quite justice. No matter how you feel about this situation, the Jeffrey Dahmer story is extremely upsetting and honestly disgusting, and if you haven't seen it yet, there's an entire Netflix documentary about it. But to answer your question, how was Jeffrey Dahmer caught? One of his victims was finally able to escape and expose his human deli to the police and eventually the world. I do want to say that because I do post weekly, I'm not able to make extremely long videos. I try my best though, and I think on average 15 to 30 minutes isn't bad. But with that being said, unfortunately, there is a lot of serial killers that have existed, and fortunately, there are a lot who have also been caught. Ideally, there wouldn't be any serial killers to catch, but that's a different story. I say this because if you guys enjoyed this topic and this video, I would love to make another one, potentially a part 2, and maybe even make a series out of it. So before we get into our last killer, if you guys enjoy learning about these serial killers and how they eventually got caught, let me know in the comments below or give this video a like. If I see enough comments, then I will definitely make a part 2. Now, let's start the story. You're a young man in the Chicago area, and you're looking for a job. You just graduated high school and you don't want to go to college. You want to get into the trades. It's a growing opportunity that doesn't require an education, and that interests you. Your uncle's friend is a local business owner and politician, and he says that this man could help get you a job. He introduces you to this man, and you guys set plans to discuss a potential employment opportunity. This man invites you over to dinner, which you're rather comfortable with because you've seen this man before and you've even been to a few of his events. He's been known to have block parties, and he even likes to dress up at times as a clown, of all things. During your time with this man, you guys discussed employment opportunities, pay, expectations, previous experience, and all of the regular things you may expect you would discuss during a job interview. The interview comes to a close and you feel optimistic, hoping that you're gonna get a job soon and potentially start a lifelong career, when the man you've been sitting across the table with asks you if you want to see a cool trick. You don't want to be rude, so you go with it, and he invites you into his basement. In the basement, he shows you handcuffs, and you're interested and kind of confused. Where did you get these? Are these real? How do they work? He doesn't really explain, but he says, put them on, I'm gonna show you something. So once again, almost hesitantly, you go with it. You allow him to handcuff you, and then he shows you that he has the keys, but not in a reassuring way, almost in a taunting sort of way. At this point, the vibe shifts immediately, and the professional man that you were just talking to upstairs is now a creepy and demented-seeming individual who, at the drop of a hat, switched. The man who you thought would become your boss is now picking up a hammer, and he is now becoming the last thing you would ever see. That man was John Wayne Gacy. We're really 3 for 3 in this video because John Wayne Gacy, like Jeffrey Dahmer and like Ted Bundy, was a very unassuming person who also committed most of his crimes in the 70s, which is an interesting overlap as well. I wonder if there was something in the water, but who knows? John Wayne Gacy lived in the northern suburbs of Chicago and owned a successful construction company and was a seemingly loyal father and husband to his second wife and 2 stepdaughters. He even attended church and was active in the Polish community. Gacy was also involved in the Democratic Party and through that had some interesting connections. Connections that I'm assuming now wish they had nothing to do with Gacy. Gacy was known, like I mentioned in the story, for throwing block parties, inviting the police, neighbors, and anybody in the community who wanted to celebrate, enjoy food, and even see a clown perform some tricks. That clown being Pogo the Clown, which was Gacy's alter ego. But even in this condition, in the northern suburbs of Chicago, living a seemingly nice life, before anything was ever found out, before he was ever caught for his 32 murders, he already had a dark and shadowy past. Gacy was previously arrested for assaulting 2 young men in Iowa. And if that's not crazy enough, this was also the exact same time when his first wife was giving birth to his child. Literally insane. For these crimes in Iowa, Gacy was caught and served time in prison. He was sentenced to 10 years but only got 18 months and was released on parole. So technically that was the first time Gacy was caught, but that's not the only time he was caught, so let's keep going. It was after this release from prison when Gacy divorced his first wife and moved to Chicago, where now we're up to speed. From the outside, it seemed that Gacy was living a great and rather successful life, but that couldn't be further from the truth. His marriage was falling apart after telling his wife that he was bisexual and wanting to get men involved in their relations, and their divorce left Gacy a lot of free time to indulge in his fantasies. On December 7th, 1976, a young man named Robert, who was working at a pharmacy, stayed after work to talk to a man who said that he could have a construction job available for him. Sound familiar? Gacy offered to pay him double what he was making. An interesting proposal to anybody. This young pharmacist obviously was never seen again. And worst of all, while Robert was meeting with Gacy, his mom was outside waiting for him to finish work and to drive him home, as she was his ride and she was gonna take him home so they could spend time together, as it was his mom's birthday. Once again, horrible timing. Fortunately, in this situation, the police weren't completely oblivious. And almost immediately after this case was brought to the police were already suspecting something was up with Gacy, specifically because they knew about his past, and one of the detectives on this case even called Gacy directly. Although, to be fair, one of Gacy's own employees went missing, and when people begged the police to investigate Gacy then, which was only a year prior, those requests were ignored. If you really want to be mad, in 1977, a young man went to the police station and reported that Gacy had kidnapped him and threatened him with a gun. And when questioned, Gacy admitted to the entire situation, but said that it was consensual and that this man was lying. And the police sided with Gacy in this situation, and he was let off. I know. Crazy. I didn't mean for this video to be a compilation of horrible police work, but that's definitely becoming a common theme. Back to the Rob situation. After the investigation continued, the police were able to get a search warrant for Gacy after he was late for the interview that they requested of him. Gacy reluctantly gave his keys to the police and he was held at the station while they searched his home. The police found a receipt for a roll of film that Rob had owned, proving that Rob had been in Gacy's house. And they also found a ring that another lost boy was missing. Although they weren't able to charge him with anything with these facts, they were able to put him under surveillance, but they did have to let him go at this point in time. Strangely, while under surveillance, Gacy invited the 2 police officers watching him into his house and offered them coffee. These officers noticed a horrible smell inside the house, a smell that a police officer would definitely recognize. The smell of death. But still, this wasn't the end quite yet. Days later, while still obviously under surveillance, Gacy was caught selling weed to a gas station employee where he was arrested and once again interrogated, where detectives had more ammo to interrogate him with, and they threatened to literally rip up his floorboards if he did not tell the truth, which They obviously meant hypothetically, but physically they did end up doing that and finding exactly what they were looking for. While in jail, he did admit to killing one person, but claimed it was only self-defense. Gacy led police to the place in his basement where he hid one body, and upon further investigation, the police found a trapdoor where they found at least 3 other bodies. When this information was shared with Gacy and Gacy knew the jig was up, he went on a multi-hour-long rant, speaking in the third person like a lunatic, admitting to everything, and claimed that he had killed at least 32 young men and boys, and that 27 of them were buried on his property. In April of 1979, a grand jury indicted Gacy on a total of 33 murders, which at that point in history was the largest number of murders associated with one person. While in custody, Gacy admitted to more and more gruesome details about his murders, and the police were able to validate all of these stories by finding evidence within his home. On February 6, 1980, Gacy pled not guilty to all of the charges, and his lawyers tried to pull a insanity card, but that didn't work. Gacy was of course found guilty and sentenced to death. After 15 years on death row, Gacy was killed by lethal injection on May 10th, 1994. But there you have it. 3 of the most infamous serial killers and how they got caught. The similarities between these people are rather glaring, and I think it's important to know that when we talk about such depraved individuals, that these are real people that hurt real people, that have real families, and there are real victims in this situation. If you guys feel like you've gotten your true crime fix, then allow me to recommend the video I made that's a bit different. It's shorter and it's one complete story. And it's a video about what it would be like to be a medieval plague doctor, and it's something I put a lot of work into. Check it out. It's on screen now. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. And as always, trust me, bro.